Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and today this video is talking about Marx on capitalism. So, Karl Marx is a figure that probably most of you have heard of. He's typically associated with communism, right? However, in truth, very little of his work was on communism. Most of his work, the vast majority, was on capitalism, right? And of course, a critique of capitalism. He has 3 volumes of Capital, right? Which are all about 1,000 pages or so. And we are reading a very small excerpt. And in his critique of capitalism, he spends a lot of time kind of going through the mechanics of how capitalism works, right? And so that's what we're looking at, and some of his labor theory of value. And this will get us a little bit of purchase on what capitalism is and how it might have ethical import kind of in its very nature, right? Marx ultimately thinks that capitalism is problematic, not because it's just bad or evil, anything like this, but mostly because it is self-defeating, right? So he thinks capitalism, left to its own devices, leads to the end of capitalism, right? So we'll get to that. But beginning, right, the kind of initial question we want to consider is, what is capitalism, right? And so one way to put this question is to think about how capital works, right? Or how like an investment works. And it's actually kind of a puzzling thing, right? We take it for granted quite a bit, but the question I kind of open up with, well, what, and Marx does as well, at least in the selection that we have, is how do you turn money into more money, right? I ask, how do you turn $100 into $110, right? That's not always the case, right? If someone gives me $5, I put it in my pocket, I take it out later, it's still $5, right? How do you turn $5 into $6, right? How do you turn $100 into $110? What is that, right? This is actually kind of a puzzling question, and how do you kind of really understand the mechanics of how that's supposed to work, right? And so to kind of break this down, Marx has a couple of very, very simple equations, right? He uses a number of terms that are important to kind of get out at the beginning. You can always follow in my notes to help you kind of follow along. One is a commodity. He uses C for commodity, right? And a commodity is very simply any kind of good or service that can be sold or exchanged, right? He uses M for money, right, which is currency, right? Something that's used to represent value, right? And then he also talks about the use value of an item, right? The value of a good or service in terms of its usefulness. And then he also kind of makes this distinction between that and exchange value, right? The value of a good or service in terms of how much money can be exchanged for it, right? So we can notice, sometimes we would think like, a particular object, right, is not as useful as it is valuable, right? Especially if you think about specialty items, something like collector baseball cards or something like this. You might think that's not very useful, but its exchange value is very high, right? So just kind of understanding some dynamics of a marketplace, right? So his first equation he kind of considers is CMC, right? So that's exchanging a commodity for money for a commodity, right? This is kind of, I'd say, like the structure of a trade economy, right? So I have a good, I have a commodity, I have something I bring, a bag of apples to the market. Someone gives me $10 for the apples, then I turn around and take that $10 and I use it to buy something else, right? Let's say, I don't know, shoes or something, right? I have an apple orchard, but I don't know how to make shoes, right? And so that's very useful because I can exchange what I have for stuff I don't have, right? And then the other kind of end of this, the other equation that goes kind of hand in hand with this is the MCM, right? Which is exchanging money for a commodity and then for money again, right? So this is buying in order to sell, right? So I buy a coffee for $5, and then, well, I guess coffee's not a good example, but let's stick with the apples, right? I buy apples and then I turn around and sell them, right? Now that is something that we are fairly familiar with, right? Maybe buy something from a local antique shop and then you sell it on eBay, right? But MCM, right, implies that you sell that commodity for the same price that you purchase it at, right? And this is no way to turn a profit, right? You need to sell it for more than what you bought it for, right? And so the kind of essential equation for capitalism is the MCM with the little dash, right? And the second M with the little dash, right, the little mark on it, denotes that you sell it for a different price than you buy it for, right? So I buy the apples for $10, and then I turn around and sell it for $11, right? Um, and that's supposed to be kind of this gives us a sense of the structure of capitalism, kind of like bare bones idea, right? And here we have kind of our key term, right? We talk about exchange value, use value, right? But the extra dollar there when I sell the apples for $11 after buying them for $10, that extra dollar is what we call surplus value, right? Or profit, right? Or capital, right? And of course, we can imagine, right? In that case, that maybe I know a guy who sells apples for 10, and then I know other people who don't know that person or whatever, and so I can buy the apples for $10 and sell them for 11, right? But of course, it would be just a matter of time before people figure out where I'm getting the apples from and that they can buy them for $1 cheaper a bag, right? So that is not going to be a very sustainable kind of business model, although it happens quite often, but it's not going to be enough to account for how capitalism kind of functions as a driving economic force, right? As an economic system, right? So we need to find a way to guarantee that I can take $100 and make it 110, right? That's the idea with a business, right? You open up a business with a certain amount of guarantee that you're going to make money from that business, right? It's not just a gamble, right? I mean, there's always variables, but really, your business model should reflect, project a certain amount of profit. So how do you guarantee that you're going to get more money out of the money that you put in, right? Well, what Marx thinks is you get it out of exploited labor, right? This is Marx's labor theory of value, right? He thinks that surplus value comes from paying workers less money than the value that they produce, right? And that's how you guarantee that you're going to make money off a business, right? So you pay workers $15 an hour based on the idea that they're going to produce $25 worth of value, right? And then you have that $10 of surplus value for every hour that you pay them. That's the idea. So to kind of break this down, I give the example of a widget factory. If you've taken any economics classes, they probably talked about widgets at some point, right? Just a generic, commodity, right? Now, at this widget factory, I give some numbers just so we can kind of see how this works. I say that rent, supplies, right, your operational costs for all the stuff you need amounts to $2,000 a day, okay? Now, you have 5 workers at this widget factory, and you pay them each $100 a day, right? So between your supplies and materials and rent and your labor, you're spending $2,500 a day, right? A widget sells for $100, okay? And what you expect out of each worker is that they make 6 widgets a day, right? So you have 5 workers that each make 6 widgets. And that means that they produce $3,000, right, a day worth of widgets that you can sell for $3,000, right? And so that means that your operating costs, including labor, $2,500, and what you make out of that is $3,000, and so that gives you $500 of surplus value, right? And that's how you can kind of guarantee that you are going to make more money than you put into the business, right? You're putting in, if you're the business owner of the widget factory, you're putting in $2,500 each day, but you're getting out 3,000 each day, right? So and you're kind of guaranteed that. Right. That's the idea, because you're paying those workers. They're basically producing $200 worth of value each, right? And you're paying them $100, right? And so based on paying them less than what they make for you, that's how you know that you're going to make money, right? Now, and so for Marx, this exploited labor is like an essential component, right? You need to have this kind of exploited labor in order to ensure that you will get more money out of the business venture than you put in, right? And this is how your $100 becomes $110, right? This is the essence of an investment, right? Anyone can buy the same materials that you can, right? Anyone who has the same amount of money can buy those same things. The materials are somewhat worthless unless you have people who can use those materials and make a commodity out of it, right? And so that's where you really get your profit. That's where you get your surplus value. So that's kind of like the basics, right? And then so out of this, you can start to see where Marx starts to make his critiques of capitalism, right? He wants to just tease out this process a little bit. There are a couple of important things that he kind of mentions right at the outset that lead him towards this idea that capitalism is self-defeating. First one is that, there's a kind of alienation or abstraction that happens from this process, right? The kind of most famous one had to do with like the proletariat or working class. And this is the idea that, as a worker, you are kind of divorced from the products of your labor, right? So if you're working on a widget factory, you don't use those widgets. The owner buys your labor, buys your time. You're there to produce for someone else. You don't see the people you sell these things to. You're very much kind of like not invested in that process. And so, it kind of leads to a very kind of dismal experience where you don't really care about what you do, this kind of thing. Right? You're alienated from your labor, and you are your labor and the products of your labor are bought from you. They're owned by someone else, right? And so he thinks, that's problematic, right? But also this kind of abstraction and alienation happens from the investor perspective as well, right? Because once you kind of think about this equation, the MCM dash, right? You can start to, from an investor's perspective, cut out the middle part, right? The C, the commodity, which is the way lots of investors kind of operate nowadays, right? If you invest on the stock exchange and the stock market, you don't necessarily have to care about or know much about the products that are being made, right? Stock projections, you invest X amount of dollars based on the fact that you're going to get X amount of dollars back, right? And so you basically invest money to make money, and the whole business itself is kind of out of the equation for you from the investor's perspective, right? You kind of are turning a blind eye to the operations of that company. And maybe the company could be doing something really bad things, or maybe they're doing really good things, but it's not really part of the investing kind of schema, right? And so this also kind of, what would you say, leads to a kind of, what would you say, um, it emphasizes the exploitation, right? It leads to people kind of pumping money into companies and expecting more money in return, and not really caring so much about what is going on in those companies, right? Um, and there's no kind of end to it, right? And we see this also a lot. Oftentimes, this is labeled as like corporate greed or capitalist greed or something like this. The idea is that, you know, once you make more money, right? You take $100, we make 110 out of that, then you go ahead and invest 110 and turn that into 140, right? And then again and again and again, right? And you get to a place where you have someone like, you know, billionaires that are making more billions and more billions, and there's kind of no end to that. And people can continue to pursue more money and more money and more money, and there's no no mechanism to kind of slow down some from doing that, right? So why is that necessarily bad? Well, let's go back to the widget example, and this kind of leads into the competitive nature of capitalism, right? So we have our widget factory, right? We're making $3,000, and we're only putting $2,500 into the company, right? And let's say another factory, a smidget factory, right, competitor, comes to town, right? And they have to buy, if they want to make a comparable product, then they have to buy at least the same quality of materials and rent space and all that kind of stuff. So they spend $2,000 on materials just like we do, right? But what they do is they pay their workers $90 a day instead of 100, right? And they also have their workers make 6 smidgets a day, just like the widget factory, right? However, if you add up all the numbers, now the smidget factory is making 550 a day in surplus value instead of 500, right? And so with that 550, it is slowly reinvested into the company. And they start off by selling their widgets or their smidgets, whatever, for $98 instead of 100, right? And so because they're selling them for 98 rather than 100, and you go to the store and you have a smidget and you have a widget and they're the same thing, but one of them is a couple bucks cheaper, you're going to buy this cheaper one, right? And then they're taking more of the market share, and that extra surplus value, they're able to maybe buy better materials, maybe hire an additional worker, and they're starting to make more smidgets, and they're cheaper, right? So what happens? Well, the original widget factory, they need to keep up. They're getting drove out of business, right? So what they do is they lower their wages to $80 a day, right? And this allows them to sell widgets for $96 or something like this, right? And I don't need to kind of continue to go through this process, but you can see then what's going to happen. The smidget factory is going to come back, and they're going to have to lower their prices, and they're going to have to lower the cost of their labor, right? This is where you, both of those factories are going to have comparable materials, and they can both use them in the same ways. So the only way you're going to be able to be competitive and kind of beat out your opponent is by lowering the cost of labor, right, and exploiting labor more, or asking people to make more widgets in the same amount of time, whatever. And this is going to continue to go on until eventually working conditions are going to be very bad, pay is going to be very low, expectations are going to be very high, right? And so this is where really Marx really thinks this kind of exploitation is bound to get out of hand because of the structure of capitalism, because of the competitive nature, right? And really, if you take this to its kind of logical conclusion, what any company wants to do or business wants to do in a capitalist kind of marketplace is to beat out their competitors, take more and more market share, right? And the ultimate conclusion of or success, right, of that endeavor is a monopoly, right? Taking all of the market share, because once you take all the market share, then you can charge whatever you want to, right? And as we probably know, a monopoly would basically destroy the capitalist system. You have no competition, you have no free market, you lose all that stuff. And so the way in which Marx thinks capitalism is self-defeating is that a participant in a capitalist system is basically aiming their ultimate standard of success is to kind of drive out their competitor and have a monopoly and get rid of the capitalist system. That's what you want. You want the whole market share, right? And so he thinks, left to its own devices, capitalism will kind of implode on its own. And it always, in the restrictions we see in capitalism always come from outside, right? The claim that the free market will take care of itself, according to Marx and other analysts, right, is a farce, right? It just won't. It doesn't have mechanisms within it to really hold itself in check. And so what we see is usually these are government restrictions that are put on, right? You have legislation, you have policies, and some of the earliest ones were like anti-child labor policies, right? Where, and they were pretty, I mean, in the Industrial Revolution, when Marx is writing, working conditions are particularly horrible, right? Some people are really working 24-hour shifts. People are dying on the job. People are, I mean, children 8, 7 years old are working 20-hour shifts, and the original kind of legislation put together in like mid 1800s was trying to curtail that a little bit, like asking children to not work more than 8 or 10 hours a day. There was no such thing as a weekend, right? They didn't really have breaks, all that kind of stuff. So so that's the basics there, right? And that's all we'll cover for today. Thanks for watching. We'll talk soon.